Our collective duty to advance durable peace in the Middle East requires from us now that we ensure respect for international law by all parties to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the protection of civilians, the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and the delivery of humanitarian aid. In the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole, through justice, accountability, and reconciliation, including by putting an end to the Israeli occupation that began in 1967 and the respect of all pertinent Security Council resolutions. Thank you.
Agradezco al
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start by thanking the Special Coordinator Tor Vendersland and Major Patrick Gosha for their participation in this meeting. We welcome their efforts and thank them for their efforts to ensure respect for international humanitarian and human rights law and to liaise with all regional actors to avoid regional escalation. As the Secretary General's latest reports point out, Resolution 2334 of the Security Council condemns, and I quote, all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror, as well as all acts of provocation, incitement, and destruction. And in this spirit, Switzerland condemns the act of terror committed by Hamas on the 7th of October and has since called for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. In his report, the Secretary General also strongly condemns these acts of terror, including the taking of hostages and the sexual violence committed during the attacks by Hamas. Since then, thousands of civilians have tragically lost their lives in Israel and many more throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. The risk of the conflict becoming regional remains real, as is shown by the growing tensions on both sides of the blue line. The situation in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem also shows this. The number of deaths amongst civilians there was already reaching frightening record highs before the 7th of October. Since then, violence has increased, and according to the UN, more than 250 Palestinians, a quarter of them children, have been killed. More than two-thirds of them died during Israeli operations, including airstrikes and incursions, particularly in the Tulkarem, Jenin, and Balata camps. Switzerland calls on Israel to respect its obligations under international law during such operations. In particular, the use of force must meet the criteria of necessity and proportionality and protect every individual's right to life and security of person. We also condemn the violent acts committed by settlers against Palestinian civilians, which reinforce the coercive environment prevailing in the West Bank. This has led to the deaths of several Palestinians, the forced displacement of more than 1,000 civilians, and the destruction of essential infrastructure since the 7th of October. The escalation of this violence is unacceptable. Switzerland recalls Israel's obligations under international law, including the obligation to protect the civilian population. In an environment of near complete immunity, independent investigations must be carried out into all violations of international law in order to bring the perpetrators to justice. In addition, Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory are illegal under international humanitarian law, as mentioned in Resolution 2334. As the occupying power, Israel must refrain from taking any measures that would introduce permanent changes into the Palestinian territory. Mr. President, in Gaza today, the protection of civilians is not being respected. Aid remains insufficient. It must be increased. Its relevance must be ensured. And above all, the conditions must be created for its effective distribution throughout the Gaza Strip. We welcome the opening of Kerem Shalom and expect it to allow the entry of humanitarian and commercial goods via a variety of access routes. In view of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, with a real risk of a collapse of this social order, we hope that this council will be able to shoulder its responsibility and speak out in support of the Gazan civilian population in need. While we recognize Israel's right to ensure its defense and security, We call on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law, in particular to fulfill their obligations in the conduct of hostilities, and in particular to respect the principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution in all circumstances. We must support any process that promotes peace and security. The full, equal, and meaningful participation of Palestinian and Israeli women is essential. The two-state solution is the only foundation for peace and stability in the region. We must help to rebuild this foundation for two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mozambique commend Ecuador's presidency for convening this briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our sincere gratitude to the briefers, Mr. Tor Winsland, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Major General Patrick Gauchin, Head of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, for the insightful briefing on the Middle East peace and process. Mr. President, Mozambique, along with other members of the Council, has voiced grave concern regarding the situation in the Palestinian occupied territory. Specifically, we highlighted several critical issues such as the expansion of settlements, violence against civilians, inflammatory language, and other provocations between the parties. All these activities are flagrant violation under the international law and contribute to aggravate the tensions as well as an obstacle to the peace in the region. It is crucial for all parties involved to exercise maximum restraint, prioritize dialogue, and work towards de-escalating tensions. The international community must continue to advocate for a just and peaceful resolution to this long-standing conflict. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The ongoing conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups has exacerbated the situation, leaving thousands of people in desperate need. Acknowledging the situation on the ground, Mozambique appreciates the tireless efforts of all stakeholders and the international community to advance the peace process. We therefore welcome several initiatives, including the high-level meetings hosted by Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and the Saudi Arabia, United States of America, Muslim and Arab leaders, Organization of Islamic States, League of Arab States, among others, to address the current crisis. Mr. President, equally important is a demonstration of goodwill by both parties. And in this vein, the immediate release of hostages is of paramount importance. Let us collectively work towards a humanitarian pause and de-escalation of the conflict to safeguard lives and uphold human dignity. Given the dire situation, we call for immediate implementation of Resolution 2712 to ensure the timely delivery of vital goods and services for civilians' well-being and protection, especially children and women. There is an urgent need to scale up and improve humanitarian access into Gaza. Lives are at stake, and we have a duty to help the most vulnerable, including children and women. We believe that only an immediate suspension of hostilities can allow for the safe and hindered humanitarian access and the delivery of life-saving assistance to the desperate civilian population. Mozambique therefore full supports the proposal for the UN Secretary General to establish a monitoring mechanism to confirm the humanitarian nature of aid consignments into Gaza. We believe that this will fast-track the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, Mozambique's stance on the Israel-Palestinian conflict is well known and emanates from its conviction that the two-state solution remains fundamental for achieving lasting peace and harmony in the region. This necessitates a common effort from both conflicting parties supported by the international community according to the Security Council resolutions 242 and 2334. We urge the parties to continue the constructive dialogue towards this goal while respecting the two-state principle. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. A humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding in Gaza, and the intense suffering of innocent Palestinian civilians shows no sign of abating. Israel is reckoning with the brutal horror of the 7 October attacks. More than 130 hostages continue to be held by Hamas, and just this morning, I met with the parents of one girl still held hostage. I will carry their words with me for a long time. As my Prime Minister has said, we need a sustainable ceasefire that breaks the cycle of violence. Hamas must stop firing rockets into Israel. All hostages must be released, and aid must flow into Gaza. This is the only way to achieve a sustainable peace based on a two-state solution in which Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security. President, we are focused on 3 areas. First, too many civilians have been killed. Israel must be targeted and precise in its efforts to address the threat posed by Hamas, and should do more to discriminate sufficiently between terrorists and civilians. Civilian infrastructure must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. The Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have repeatedly delivered this message to Israel, and we will continue to do so. Second, we need to continue to work on increasing the amount of humanitarian support into Gaza through as many direct routes as possible. The agreement to open Kerem Shalom is welcome. We look forward to its urgent implementation. Israel should also immediately increase the range of humanitarian items allowed into Gaza. Third, as we heard today, in recent months, the violence of extremist settlers in the West Bank has dramatically increased. Since 7 October, there have been 8 Palestinians killed by Israeli settlers, including 1 child, and at least 1,257 displaced amid settler violence and access restrictions. We strongly condemn these hateful acts which undermine prospects for peace. We are banning those responsible for settler violence from entering the UK to make sure our country cannot be a home for people who commit these intimidating acts. Israel must also do more to hold perpetrators of settler violence to account and to end the demolition and confiscation of Palestinian property. And we reiterate our call on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and its lower aqueduct. We are clear, these settlements are illegal under international law, present an obstacle to peace, and threaten the physical viability and delivery of a two-state solution, which must become a reality to ensure justice and peace for Palestinians and Israelis. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank Special Coordinator Winnesland and Major General Gocha for their briefings that were just delivered. Nearly 80 days into the new outbreak of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, more than 2 million innocent people in Gaza have been suffering from unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. On the 11th of December, thanks to the arrangements made by the governments of the UAE and Egypt, I visited the Al Arish and Rafah crossings together with the ambassadors of a number of council members and gained a hands-on experience of the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Egypt and other countries have made tremendous efforts to alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground, but they still face many difficulties. On the one hand, the people of Gaza have no access to water, electricity, food, fuel, medicine. They simply lack the minimum supplies for survival. On the other hand, a large number of trucks delivering supplies are waiting in line, while the supplies piled up at the warehouses in Al Arish cannot be delivered in time to the people in need. What is even more worrying is that due to Israel's indiscriminate bombardment, the humanitarian relief network, comprising a number of UN agencies operating in Gaza, is on the verge of paralysis, and the safety and security of their personnel cannot be guaranteed. In this context, the UAE, on behalf of the Arab states, has tabled the draft text of a new council resolution aimed at removing bottlenecks to humanitarian access and alleviating the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. The UAE has held extensive consultations with council members on the draft text and has listened to the views and opinions of UN humanitarian agencies and has gained the support of the majority of council members. China has joined in the co-sponsorship of the draft resolution. We believe that no country should be hesitant out of any reason regarding this draft resolution. We urge relevant council members to take a constructive approach and support the council in taking meaningful, life-saving, and immediate actions. It should be noted that the UAE's draft resolution is an emergency initiative to address the immediate urgent needs arising from the current humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Facing the prolonged Gaza conflict and the escalations in the West Bank, the Council must further play its dual role and take action for realizing a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and early date, for restoring regional peace, and for upholding fairness and justice. First, the realization of a ceasefire remains the overriding prerequisite. Only a ceasefire can prevent greater civilian casualties, including those of hostages. Only a ceasefire can prevent the regional conflict from spiraling out of control. And only a ceasefire can prevent the prospects of a political solution from being completely killed. The international community has repeatedly and overwhelmingly called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, yet Israel continues its bombing and shelling. Schools, hospitals, mosques, Christian churches, and refugee camps have been repeatedly targeted in military operations, and there can be no justification for such attacks. It must be pointed out that causing more civilian casualties in Gaza will not hold the solution for rescuing the hostages, nor will it lead to greater security for any party. We urge Israel to immediately reverse its course of action and stop its indiscriminate military attacks and collective punishment against the people of Gaza. Second, every effort must be made to prevent the West Bank situation from getting out of control. While the eyes of the international community are focused on Gaza, violence committed by
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. I also thank Major General Patrick Gauchef for his briefing. Since the Council's last meeting on this resolution in September, the situation has deteriorated on all fronts. We have witnessed an unprecedented scale of death and destruction in the occupied Palestinian territory and in Israel, the consequences of which will no doubt reverberate for years to come. This year, the intensification of deadly violence against civilians in the region, including acts of terror, has skyrocketed. This unyielding cycle of violence has pushed us further away from a political horizon than in any point in recent history. It is painfully clear that the conflict in Gaza is taking an unimaginable toll on the population. A shocking number of civilians have been killed and displaced. Countless others continue to face the denial of basic necessities. Malta stresses that respect for international humanitarian law is paramount. All parties are obliged to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are protected. A significant scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza is desperately needed, including through the opening of further crossing points. This must happen in tandem with assurances for the safety of UN and humanitarian workers, including of their premises. The rising death toll of humanitarian and UNRWA staff is completely unacceptable, and attacks on religious sites and persons seeking refuge within are also unacceptable, as is the number of journalists that have been killed in this conflict. Malta stresses that an immediate humanitarian ceasefire is now an imperative to ensure the necessary protection of civilians and de-escalate this conflict. We continue to strongly condemn the unjustifiable Hamas terror attack of 7th October. Indiscriminate rocket fire and acts of sexual violence are equally condemnable. We reiterate our calls on Hamas to release the remaining hostages immediately and unconditionally in accordance with Resolution 2712. We also underline the urgency for humanitarian actors to be allowed access to the remaining hostages as long as they are held captive. Too many women and children on both sides continue to unjustly suffer the consequences of this conflict. Children have been abducted and are being killed and maimed at staggering rates. Children face heightened risk of malnutrition, severe illness, dehydration, and psychological trauma. They deserve our undisputed protection. We commend UNICEF staff and their partners for providing life-saving aid and psychosocial support to all children, in particular inside Gaza, in extremely difficult circumstances. We also underline that attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinian residents and properties in the West Bank are inexcusable. Such acts must not be allowed to take place with impunity. Settlements, demolition of homes, and displacement of Palestinians violate international law and Resolution 2334. They constitute an obstacle to peace, inflame tension, and threaten the viability of an independent, contiguous Palestinian state. We reiterate our strong opposition to Israel's settlement policy and actions advancing settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. President, urgent steps must be taken to prevent regional escalation and to relaunch credible negotiations and engagement between both parties. A meaningful political horizon cannot be achieved unless we ensure that the Palestinian Authority has the fiscal stability and support it needs. Malta reaffirms its commitment to a just and comprehensive resolution of the conflict based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. It has never been more critical than that the international community engages in meaningful peace-forward efforts, placing regional stakeholders at the forefront of any deliberations and addressing the core issues of this conflict. We cannot return to an unsustainable status quo. The violence and suffering must stop. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Tor Venesland, and the head of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization mission, Mr. Gosha. We thank them for the overview of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, where for 2.5 months we have been witnessing an unprecedented in the number of victims massacre. Since the last meeting on the Council on this issue on the 8th of December, 10 days have elapsed, and the number of its victims in this time has grown further. To date, since the beginning of the Israeli military operation in Gaza, about 19,000 people lost their lives. 70% of them are women and children. 90% of the Gaza population, about 2 million people have become internally displaced. The victims of indiscriminate Israeli actions is also amongst Israeli hostages. Add to that the total blockade of Gaza, including downed comms, harsh restrictions on humanitarian aid supplies. There is an acute shortage in the strip of water, fuel, medicines, and the civic order, and on the brink of collapse. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom confirms that no one is safe in Gaza. Out of 36 medical facilities, until recently, only 8 functioned partially, but they didn't have water or electricity. There is an illustration also here through the number of staff killed. The ICRC and UN staff were killed together with their families, including babies. Under attack, including repeated attack, are about 90 UN facilities, 133 staff of the organization killed. And this, according to the UN data, is the largest single loss the US has ever suffered. The head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, said the disaster in the enclave in the strip is the worst he's ever seen, especially taking into account that people have nowhere to go and the stated goal of eliminating Hamas cannot be implemented. According to mass media, Israel dropped about 29,000 air bombs on Gaza, which is comparable to the number dropped by the US and UK throughout their entire military aggression in Iraq in 2003. We have received shocking news from the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem on the 16th of December during the Holy Family festivities in church, which was a refuge for many families. An Israeli sniper killed 2 Christians. 7 more people were wounded as they tried to protect their loved ones. According to witness account, there were no warnings issued to that. On the same day, Israel had an airstrike against the monastery of Mother Teresa, which was marked as a shelter since the beginning of the escalation. And such attacks continue at the time when everyone is preparing for the Christmas celebrations on the 25th of December. Mr. President, against the background of disaster in Gaza, what we have somewhat in the background in the news is what is happening in the West Bank, whereas violence rages there as well. There are continued armed raids by Israel and brutal attacks by Israeli settlers as a result of an Israeli incursion into Nur Shams camp. 5 Palestinians were killed in the last 24 hours, and the day before, another Palestinian was killed in a Farah camp. Therefore, since the 7th of October, the overall number of victims of the so-called Israeli operations in the West Bank is at least 293 people. And in this context, we like to underscore the fact that the clearing of the West Bank is something that Israel has been doing for a long time, even before 7th October. And then there was no link with terror threats or security issues, which is a slogan that the West of Jerusalem is using for its unprecedented in scope operation in Gaza. In parallel to that, in the West Bank, there's a demolition of Palestinian houses without construction permits, and it's virtually impossible to receive such a permit. There is also continued settlement policy prosecuted by the Western Jerusalem, including funding for the expanded settlements. Such plans are being approved by the Israeli authorities in parallel with the planned destruction of Gaza. Mr. President, the scope of humanitarian disaster in the area of conflict compelled the Secretary General to invoke his powers under Article 99 of the Charter and call on the Council to pass a decision on ending the bloodbath. But despite the efforts made by the absolute majority of Security Council members, all of the drafts submitted were blocked by Washington. Washington, instead of helping civilians, is providing Israel massively with all kinds of weapons which are used to kill Palestinian civilians. Currently, everyone should understand that the stalling of collective UN efforts is not a result of some kind of objective institutional issues, but rather as a result of stubborn and egotistical ambitions on the part of American leadership. It will not be an exaggeration to say that there is a consensus in the world about the need to have an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. And the only state besides Israel which stands against this, pitting themselves against the entire international community, is the United States. After the tragic events of the 7th of October, the policy of Washington in the region has reached a strategic impasse. The Hamas raid, for which there is no and cannot be a justification, cannot be considered separately for what Israel is doing to construct and expand settlements on Palestinian territories, or separate from the failed policy by the US aimed at ignoring the Palestinian issue, ignoring the aspirations for their own state, and their work to undermine the international basis for the Middle East settlement, including the two-state solution. With Washington's assist, the UN resolutions pledging a state for the Palestinians are being stonewalled by Israel for more than a decade against a background of illegal expansion of settlements and seizing of Palestinians' land and property. This is a background, also the blockade of Gaza. And against this background, we have several generations of Gazan grown up against that. Our position has been consistent. We cherish our historically close relationship with the Palestinians and Israelis alike. We condemned any kind of act of terror or indiscriminate use of force against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We advocate the end of hostilities in Gaza, ensuring the safety of civilians and the release of those detained. At the same time, we're consistent in our advocacy for the creation of an independent and viable Palestinian state within 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Our approach is based on the international legal basis for the Middle East settlement, including the resolutions passed by the General Assembly and Security Council. Furthermore, we call for the implementation of the only to-date product that Security Council has on Gaza, Resolution 2712, which, as weak as it is, at least contains a mandatory for implementation appeals to parties to establish humanitarian pauses. There has to be an international monitoring of the implementation of this Security Council decision on the UN aegis. We're grateful to Secretary General for working through the options for this monitoring. We are studying them very closely, and we expect that the Council in the very near future will decide on the option to choose and will pass a decision on that in a resolution. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante de la Federación.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank Special Coordinator Mr. Tor Winnisland and Major General Patrick Gouchard for their briefing. We welcome the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334, which addresses some of the crucial issues surrounding the Middle East peace process. We regret that the prospect for our collective aspiration for the two-state solution continues to be obscured by the current highly degenerative environment in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, the briefings we have just received paint a gloomy picture as far as the two-state solution is concerned. We know that actions on the ground by both Israelis and Palestinians are counterproductive to the search for a lasting peace in the Middle East. We reiterate our position that violence has never been successful as a tool for the resolution of any conflict, and will not be in the ongoing conflict. We are equally distressed about the appalling humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories, which seems to deteriorate on a daily basis as the war lingers on. We call for the respect of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the protection of all civilians and civilian infrastructure. We, however, welcome the gesture by the Israeli government to open its border crossing at Kerem Shalom for direct delivery of humanitarian assistance and supplies to the ever-increasing number of internally displaced people in Gaza, including women, children, and the elderly who desperately need them. Mr. President, as a council, we must do everything within our means to bring the hostilities to an end and give peace a chance. We must also recognize and accept the importance of resuming the stalled peace process. It is our firm belief that the resumption of the peace process will promote confidence-building measures